I apologize for starting a little bit late. We realized that since they announced the Afghan women selling things at 8:30, that we might need a few more minutes, so thank you for your patience. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Catherine Turpin back to Montview. She's going to be talking this morning on the topic of making space for God, leaning into the mystery of the Incarnation. We've had Catherine here before, I think a couple of times over the last 10 years or so, and so I'm just really grateful that she was willing to join us this morning. Dr. Turpin is on the faculty at Iliff School of Theology, where she's been since 2002. She's had different positions, but she's currently the Associate Dean for Curriculum and Assessment and Director of the MDiv program, which is huge responsibility. I think this was interesting. Her current research, I just learned, interests include how histories of oppression and structural inequality inform the identity of white women and unlearning and disrupting white supremacy in the practices of education and theological reflection. In fact, she has a new book coming out called Questioning Our Faith in Practice, Unlearning White Supremacy in Practical Theology. She also has written a book called Tweens, Engaging the Bible with Younger Adolescents, and has 3 young, growing into young adulthood children herself. And she's authored several other things, but also one called Branded, Adolescents Converting from Consumer Faith. Don't you just love all those titles? That's great. So feel free to chat with Catherine if she has time after her talk, but we're gonna maybe go a little bit after the 10:30 time just to make up for a little time we lost. And but if you have to slip out, we understand. So let's welcome Dr. Catherine Turpin.
So thank you all for being here this morning. I'm obviously, as you can tell from the title, working far afield from my expertise. I often say that my role at Iliff is kind of utility infielder in the arts of ministry. I teach in worship and education and spirituality and things like that. But this morning when Mary Jo talked to me and said, well, we're working on this theme in Advent around waiting for God or making space for God after doing a long fall, really focusing on anti-racism, which is what I've also been focusing on, but we're gonna do something different this morning. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna lean into that. And really 2 things came to mind when I thought about Advent and I thought about waiting for God. And one was Thomas Luis de Victoria's O Magnum Mysterium, which we're gonna visit in a minute. And the other was just the mystery of incarnation. And I don't know where you are in your life cycle. I do have 3 young adult children now, 2 in college, and the youngest just got his driver's license yesterday, so they're kind of grown up and getting big, and all of that sort of pressure when they were little to make sure they just knew these stories and that there was magic somehow in Christmas, and all of that has kind of drifted away. And then you come back to the question of, well, then what about these stories? What about these stories for me? What about these stories for us as the community of faith? And so incarnation is what I want to do this morning. So I have sort of 2 movements. We're going to spend a little time geeking out a little bit over the notion of incarnation and what it means and why it matters. I will geek out. Hopefully you can follow along and enjoy that with me. And then the second half is thinking more personally about the stories of Mary and the incarnation in Luke 1 and sort of trying to relate to those. So if you're someone who likes to just hear a speaker talk, the first part will feel great and you'll suffer through the second part where I'm asking you to talk to a neighbor. And for those of you who get tired of listening to people talk, maybe the second half will be more fun for you. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the notion of incarnation. And literally, it means embodied in flesh are taking on flesh. So if you eat in Mexican restaurants and have carne asada, or if you know Spanish, right, you know, carne is like Latin for meat, right? This is a really gritty kind of term, like becoming meaty or taking on flesh. And we often look to John 1, the 14th chapter, right? The Word became flesh, and sometimes it says dwelt among us or made a home among us. But in Greek, the word is literally pitched a tent, that God, the Word, Logos, the sort of order of all of the universe, pitched a tent alongside us. It's a very kind of humble image of moving in next door, right? If you think about people who are nomadic and moving around, pitching a tent is sort of what you do to rest, being together, right? It's this very basic image of God incarnating, taking on flesh, pitching a tent next door, coming among us. So I think in the church, over the last 2 millennia, I'm now talking very broadly, right, has really thought a lot about Jesus' death and resurrection and the importance of that moment for the salvation of humanity, right? So we have all of these stories about like God's anger or justice at the fallenness of humanity had to be satisfied, and so God sent his son to be sacrificed to sort of perform a ritual of fixing that, either in law terms or in honor terms, other kinds of ways, and that's the moment that humanity was saved, right? It was the death and resurrection of Jesus. This got run kind of through in the US, particularly the Civil War, and a lot of our hymnody is really rests in the sort of idea of blood sacrifice for a greater good. If you check the dates in your hymnal, you'd be surprised how many of them were written in 1864, 65. So we kind of, with that and the Great Awakening and the idea of these sort of revival movements where you really focused on this sacrifice and how it, you believed in it and then you were saved, right? And that got continued on through American evangelicalism. So you have people now holding up John 3:16 at football games. Like that is the moment where humanity was saved. We're clear. Jesus' death and resurrection. The early church did not feel that way. They did not have that story straight in the way that we have it straight 2,000 years later. And they really thought a lot about the incarnation as the moment of salvation. And so I want to kind of bring that back into this room a little bit for us, and then tell you why I think it matters. So there's a couple of verses in Paul where Christ is sort of described as the second Adam, right? So I've got them up here. I won't read all of them for you, but the idea that like, because Adam fell and all of humanity joined in Adam's sin, there had to be a new Adam who was obedient to God all the way, who somehow was like all of humanity got to take that on, and then we all got to be saved. And so there was Adam and there was Jesus, and because God in Jesus took on human flesh, all of humanity got a big redo. It's called the recapitulation theory, right? There you can see like all of humanity was made of dust, like Adam, literally the earth, Adama, right? And with Jesus, we were all made of heavenly stuff. So it was this sort of thinking of incarnation, the moment of God taking on human flesh, as the moment of salvation for all humanity. It was done then. That was the important part of it, right? And this is the story for like the first 3 centuries of the church, right? Which is funny because it's so lost now, I think, in the way that we think about salvation and how it happens historically. So you have Irenaeus of Lyon, who's a very early church teacher, right? He lived 130 to 200 AD, saying, Jesus became what we are so that he might bring us to be even what he is himself, right? So by taking on human flesh, God deifies humanity. Or later, Athanasius of Alexandria, a little later, a great African bishop, would say he, here being God, in Jesus, was incarnate so that we might be made God, right? So there's this sense of, by taking on human flesh was able to become like God. And this was a really controversial kind of statement at the time, and there were a lot of fights in the church over this, right? So you can see this left over in our creeds when we're talking about Jesus being fully human and fully divine. And the fight was that human bodies, and people I think in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century knew this even more than we do today, are corruptible, right? They leak, they have gross fluids that come out of them, people get sick, they die. And they're like, how is it that God would have one of these things, right? Have a body. That's ridiculous. So there were people who were Christian followers or believers, early people, who were like, yeah, no, Jesus wasn't really fully human. God remained God and incorruptible, didn't take on this flesh stuff that we have, right? It was one of the early, now we call it a heresy, but at the time, there were believers who thought, no, this whole idea of incarnation, we're not going there. And so people like Irenaeus and Athanasius and other teachers of the church were like, no. Yeah, God really took on a body, really fully human. This was really important. So the idea was that by taking on human flesh, God in Jesus restored the image of God to humanity that had fallen with Adam. And this is the moment of salvation. So why does that even matter, right? I mean, when you start talking about like these big historical things, it's sort of like, well, okay. Does it matter if we tell the story that it happened through a sacrificial act of death and resurrection, or does it matter that it happened at the moment of God taking on human flesh, that all of humanity was restored, right? And I want to introduce you now to a more recent theologian. This is a Presbyterian even, Dolores Williams. Very recently died, just about 2 weeks ago. And a really important womanist theologian, which if you don't know that term, it's an Alice Walker term for basically a feminist who is African American, who deals with both the sort of concerns of racism and sexism. It's a fuller kind of expression of that kind of experience of the intersection of those two identities. And Dolores Williams wrote a really important book called Sisters in the Wilderness, where she challenged the problematic nature of sacrificial understandings of Jesus' salvation. And her concern was, if the deepest story we tell about how God wanted to save humanity is that somebody had to suffer and die for somebody else to have a better life, that really sets up some terrible stories. And an example of this is like Tom Cotton saying, slavery, okay, yeah, it was bad. But if it weren't for slavery, the U.S. wouldn't have the economy that it has now, so it was really a good thing in the long run, right? So that notion, and this is what Dolores Williams was on, that some people exhibit godliness by their sacrifices so that other people can have a better life, if that's our deepest story, that's the good news we have, it's not enough. It's not okay. She was not happy about that. So she said, we really have to reject these notions of salvation that are based in sacrificing one person for the good of another, and really get back to the earliest notions of salvation, which her language, God through Jesus gave humankind a new vision to see the resources for positive, abundant, eternal life, right? So she's arguing that in the incarnation, the image of God is restored in humanity, and we can recognize that there's more to who we are than sinners who need someone else to suffer for us to be acceptable, right? So it sounds like this kind of woo-woo off their abstract theological stuff, but these stories fund other stories that we tell about ourselves now, right? And that's why they're important. And this idea of the image of God being restored in humanity through Jesus' incarnation, it was actually a really important idea for a long time. So in the Renaissance, right, like the love for art and science and reason was connected to Christianity through the image of God being demonstrated in humans through these creative acts, right? And so after this horrible Black Plague had taken out all of Europe, and the Renaissance is sort of born of that, one of the ideas that really got people through that was the notion of the image of God restored in humanity. So they seem like ancient ideas, but they also fund our current stories, which is why we tell the story. So this is why today I wanted to come talk to you a little bit about incarnation as salvific, or as a moment of God's presence among us being made very clear. So when I talk theologically in these big stories and these ancient stories, that's sometimes a little hard to relate to. So I'm going to dive right in with Mary, which is what I was initially asked to come talk about Mary's mysticism. And I'm like, I'm the least mystical person I know. I don't really know how to think about that. But then I was like, okay, I'm going to step into this story and sort of see what it has to say about incarnation and how that relates to our own spirituality. So that's where we're headed now. And I want to focus on 4 moments in this from Luke 1 in Mary's story, incarnation. And I had great fun looking. I mean, the church over time has been so inspired by these sets of stories that there's so many icons and paintings. So we have some of these coming along. This is one of them, an icon of the incarnation. Got Mary with little Jesus there. Already with halo fully formed in the womb. But 4 things happen in Mary's story. 1, Gabriel shows up and declares her favored, right, that she's honored. And then she's overshadowed by the Most High, this lovely little story about how she ends up with Jesus in the womb, apparently. She runs away and visits with her cousin Elizabeth. And then she bursts into prophetic song. These are the sort of movements we have with Mary in this story. So I'm going to talk about some of those. So the first one, this is Luke 1, by the way, 28, right? This is Common English Bible, which is a recent scholarly translation. So when the angel came to her, he said, "Rejoice, favored one, the Lord is with you." She was confused by these words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. The angel said, "Don't be afraid, Mary. God is honoring you." And this is a painting, early American, like 1930, I guess not so early American, early 20th century, American painting. It's Henry Ossawa Turner, who was the son of an African Methodist Episcopal minister. So he's in the AME tradition. This is Mary at the Annunciation being visited by Gabriel. And I'm sure that Henry Ossawa Turner was thinking that she was sort of being humble in this position, but I think this is a great example of adolescent side-eye. Do you all know what I mean when I say that? Right, that kind of like, what? Like looking off to the side. That's her response to this right here. And I think it fits the text, right? That she was confused by Gabriel's words and wondered what they meant. There's this kind of sense of like uncertainty here and wonder at what's going on. And I think a lot of us, when I originally I was talking through this session with a friend of mine who's also an AME pastor, and I said, I think I'm going to ask them, like, at what moment did they feel that God honored or favored them? And she's like, you cannot ask a room full of people to tell stories about when they felt favored or honored by God. That's a really hard question, a really deep question. And I think that's right. It is, and for Mary too, it's hard to accept that somehow we would be honored or favored by God. I mean, by all accounts, we think she's kind of just a normal young woman, right? Just a poor person hanging out in the, Middle East in the ancient times. There's nothing about her virtue, her honor, the great works that she's done to be declared favored by God. She's just this kid, right, hanging out. So I think all of us have that sense of what does it mean to be honored. And this, again, is where incarnation matters, right? Because if we're not just humans, not just flesh, but we are people for whom the image of God has been restored within us, and that we too could be like God, that's a very different way of thinking of yourself as a human. The Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero has a Christmas sermon where he's talking about the significance of this. And it's a longer piece, but this is part of what he says. If you know, so Romero was a martyr in the church. He was murdered for his actions in El Salvador. He was kind of a company man in the Roman Catholic Church who got promoted to be archbishop and then was really moved by the experience of the poor and the oppressed in the midst of all of the civil wars that were going on then, and really took the side of the farm workers and the peasants and people like that, people who were being imprisoned and tortured by the military forces at the time, which is what got him killed. But anyway, this sermon, you can hear this, right, in his sermon. So he's saying, would that my voice might reach the imprisoned like a ray of light of Christmas hope, might say also to you the sick, the elderly in the home for the aged, the hospital patients, you that live in shacks and shanty towns, you coffee harvesters trying to garner your only wage for the whole year, you that are tortured, God's eternal purpose has thought of all of you. God loves you, and like Mary, God incarnates that thought in God's womb, right? He's using male pronouns here. I'm not. But so this idea that the most outcast, the people being tortured by the government, the people, coffee workers who get paid once a year and have to make a living off of that, that those people are incarnated in God's womb, that they are held in his thoughts in that way, is such a powerful sort of image that we're reminded of with Mary, who's also declared favored, this teenager, unmarried, virgin by the stories. All right, so here is my question for you, but I'm on the wisdom of my colleague, Jennifer Leith, not going to ask you to share with a neighbor, but just ask you to think for a minute. Gabriel is an angel. It's the biblical word for God's messenger. God shows up to tell Mary she's favored, right? So who are the people in your life who have looked at you and you have known in the moment that they've looked at you that you are honored, that you're respected, that you're favored, right? Who are those messengers in your own life? And maybe your dog when you come home at the end of the day. It may have been your mother, your grandmother, it may be a friend. But I just want you to think about that for a minute. And while we do that, hopefully, I'm going to play Thomas Luis de Victoria's O Magnum Mysterium, which is about this moment where God becomes incarnate. Well, let's see if I can actually do that. But think a minute. Who among God's messengers have looked at you? Not the end of that song. You should listen to it sometime. So let's take a moment and just say thanks to God for those people who have looked at us with honor and respect. What a gift they are to recognize our own worth when we don't feel it necessarily on our own. That piece by Tomás Luis de Victoria, who's a Renaissance contemporary, maybe student of Palestrina, so many years ago. The text for that is from the Roman Catholic morning prayer for Christmas Day, and it basically says, what a great mystery that God would be in a manger in a stable, that the Son of God would be in the Virgin's womb, basically. It's just like, how mysterious is this? How wild is that? And I often think of that song when I can remember being in a chapel service at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and there are a lot of different people at Candler, and different people would take different chapel services. And when African-American students would take it and the Spirit got moving in there, you can imagine, you've probably seen this in movies if you've not experienced it yourself, but the whole room would bust forth. There would be a lot of energy, a lot of clapping, singing, moving. When white folks took hold of the chapel and the Spirit showed up and the Spirit moved, it was a moment of utter kind of piercing stillness of holiness. And that song, I think, for me, represents that. It's kind of what the white Spirit looks like when it shows up in worship. It's that moment of like, oh, somebody said, sounds like a choir of angels showed up in here when I was trying to run it through earlier, right? This is kind of a European-descended encapsulation of that moment of holiness, the Spirit intervening. And in the Bible story, this is the moment when Gabriel says, the Holy Spirit will come over you and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the one who is to be born will be holy. He will be called God's Son. And like I said, I'm telling you, in European art, this moment has many representations, right? So, and they always have, you see the ray of sun coming down to Mary here. There's a lot of that kind of imagery, like, that's the Holy Spirit overshadowing. Or here, these are interesting, actually, theologically. These are, again, 15th, 16th century, just to place them. The one on the left, I don't know if you can see, it's a little dove coming down. Do you see that onto Mary? And on the right is the name of God in Hebrew, I think. It's certainly meant to represent that. And that's because this verb, overshadow, that shows up here in this text, which is kind of an odd little word, only shows up a couple places in the Bible, very few places. One is with Moses on the mountain, and then in the tabernacle, when Moses' face shines and he's sort of glowing with God's presence. On the Mount of Transfiguration, overshadow is the verb used for Jesus. Again, face shining on a mountain. There's allusions back and forth there. There's some baptismal sort of, right, the Holy Spirit came down like a dove at the baptism kind of imagery going on here. And then in this moment where the Holy Spirit overshadows Mary, right? So it's like the super potent, powerful biblical word for what it's like when God's presence shows up. It's called a theophany, like a revelation of God. All right, so we got this humble woman giving side-eye to Gabriel, like, what kind of greeting is this? I'm not sure what's going on. And then this moment of theophany, that the only other biblical people who experience it are Moses and Jesus, right? So a pretty big moment in that kind of thing. These are from the Basilica in D.C., which is an Annunciation Basilica, right? That's the name of it. And I love, again, we've got the glowy light thing going on in this mosaic on the right, but the one on the left I particularly love. Overshadowing somehow turns into billowing clouds of something. It's a hard thing to give representation to, right? These kind of super mystical experiences of the presence of God. These are more contemporary versions, people trying to make sense of that. I confessed earlier, I'm the least mystical person I know. This is not a huge part of my spirituality, these moments of like divine visitation. They are for other people. I hear stories from seminarians about them all the time, right? So I know that this is an experience that humans have. I'm going to tell you the one story of when this happened in my own life. And this is not a story I tell publicly, and you'll know why as soon as I tell you, very often. But the day that I found out I was pregnant with my third child, who was conceived against all scientific efforts to prevent that, was a horrifying day in my life. I was 3 years into my time at Iliff. I had already had one baby there. I wasn't tenured yet. There were no plans to have more children until I was tenured. And suddenly, I totally unexpectedly found out I was pregnant. And the next day was Transfiguration Sunday at church. And I sat in the pew and listened to this story of the disciples going up on the mountain with Jesus and the light shining down. And if you remember that story, the disciples run around and have no idea what to make of it, right? They're like, we should build houses for God to live here, or what are we gonna do? And for the first time I understood that story, because I had had this experience that was totally inexplicable in my life, that felt like a weird presence of the holy, and my response was to be horrified, terrified, and totally out of sorts about it. That was my first response to finding out that I was pregnant with my son, which is why I don't tell the story very publicly often, now that I'm live streaming it. He knows that he was not a planned child. That for the first time I was like, oh, this is why angels are always like, okay, don't be afraid, right? That's the first thing they always say when they show up. Because sometimes the presence of God is not comforting. It's unsettling, it's disruptive. It's this moment of, we like to turn it into glowy warmness, right? But in fact, the biblical representations of these kind of moments of deep presence of God is often terror is the first response, right? All right, so I told my story. I am gonna invite you now to tell a story, to think for a minute. And so maybe your story is not about finding out that you're pregnant when you weren't expecting to. Maybe your story is more about, another one for me would have been the day that my college roommate called me and was like, my grandfather's dying, my mom's a new pastor in a new church, she doesn't know who to call in that church to come be in the hospital with her, will you go be in the hospital with her? So here I was at 22 with my roommate's mother, who I knew, kind of, while her father was dying. And I sat there with her for an hour while he died. And it was ridiculous in certain ways, and I was totally out of my element. And it was one of those moments where God was so utterly present that it couldn't be denied, right? So that's another way that I've had experience. Again, I was disrupted. I felt like I had no business being there. It was weird and unexpected, and yet there was God, right? So I'm going to invite you to turn to someone near you and think about your own experience and think, are there moments where you've had that kind of startling, disruptive presence of God, a theophany? God showed up. And it could be much more mundane. It could be a sunset that you watched. It could be a butterfly showing up when you weren't expecting it and you were caught off guard. We can take it down from the big stories. So I know this is a big stretch, but I'm going to invite you to turn to a neighbor and see if we can encourage each other with these stories of God showing up. That's right. These pews are not great for that, but you can do it. So I'll invite you to finish up the part of the story you're telling. And from the sounds in the room and the initial laughter and then more serious conversations, I'm going to trust that you've had these moments too, some of you, right? That you could give witness to of just an overwhelming, unsettling beam from the heavens kind of sense of the presence of God. And if you haven't, that's what the next section is for. So for those of you who are like, yeah, no, a little more of a sturdy soul, don't quite have those kinds of experiences, this next section is for you. So Mary has this whole encounter with Gabriel, and the next thing she does is she hightails it out of there, right? So she leaves where she is, and she runs off to visit with her beloved cousin, we don't know how beloved, but cousin, Elizabeth. So Mary, this again is Luke 1, got up and hurried to a city in the Judean highlands. She headed for the hills, literally, right? She entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And then there's a whole thing that goes on, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And it says that Mary stayed with Elizabeth for 3 months and then returned to her home. So my eldest child may or may not be named Elizabeth. I do love this story. And again, great iconography here of this moment of Elizabeth and Mary's visitation. A lot of pregnant ladies catching up with each other. Lots of kindred, loving, hugging. It's like women's friendship embodied in all of these icons, which I love. Also, I love the sort of biological graphicness of the icons, right? So there you have the two women. This is Mary on the left, and you know that because on the right, that's John, eventually the Baptist, leaping in the womb, like literally. Anyway, I think these are very fun. But the picture on this side is a little fuzzy, but it's actually from one of my wedding pictures. I got married in December in a church in Atlanta. And the church's tradition, they had all these big quilts that women in the church had made that they hung before the church, and the one for Advent was Mary and Elizabeth's visitation. And so I got married underneath two giant pregnant ladies. That's a close-up on them. So anyway, this story is close to me in certain ways. But I just love the spirit of joy and connection and the capturing of, okay, so sometimes God comes like a bolt of sunshine or theophany or overshadowing or these big mystical moments of presence. And sometimes you find God in a beloved friend who takes you in when your life has just fallen apart, right? So when Elizabeth literally has this little cousin who shows up pregnant, she's not married, she comes and hides out in her house for 3 months, right? And Elizabeth is her husband's a big priest, they're very religious Jewish people at the time, right? So it's not like this is outside of God's house in some way, right? But this moment where the face of God looks like your cousin who takes you in when things have gone to hell in a handbasket, right? And for many of us, that's more like what our encounters of incarnation of God with us look like, right? It's those friends who take us in when things are going wrong, who listen to us, who meet us in our moments of utter dissolution when things are not going well, right? And it's a much more, I guess one of the implications of incarnation is that we carry the image of God. And so that when people come to us in their time of need, or when we go to other people in our times of need, we find God there, right? The image of God is present in that encounter. And so I'm going to invite you to think about, right, there's kind of the visit from Gabriel, big, high, holy moment, and the visit with Elizabeth, two cousins getting together, right, when things are going badly. So I'm going to invite you to tell another story. We're going to have a different song this time. But this time, when has a visit with a friend given you courage, affirmation, or support in the midst of a chaotic time? Also, theophany God's presence overshadowing us, right? So I invite you to tell those stories to the stylistic soundings of James Taylor, because you got a friend, another symbol of theophany. So find your partners again, tell that story this time. Maybe, maybe not.
When you're down and troubled and you need a helping hand and nothing, oh, nothing's going right. Close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there to brighten up even your darkest night. You just call up my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running. Oh yeah, babe, to see you again. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, now all you got to do is call, and I'll be there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You've got a friend. If the sky above you should turn dark and full of clouds, and that old north wind should begin to blow, keep your head together and call my name out loud now. Soon I'll be knocking upon your door. You just call up my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running. Oh yes, I will see you again. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, yeah. All you got to do is call, and I'll be there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, ain't it good to know that you got a friend when people can be so cold? They'll hurt you and desert you. Well, they'll take your soul if you let them. Oh, yeah, but don't you let them. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running to see you again. Oh, babe, don't you know about winter, spring, summer, or fall? Hey, now all you got to do is call. Lord, I'll be there. Yes, I will. You've got a friend. You've got a friend. Yeah. Ain't it good to know you got a friend? Ain't it good to know you got a friend? Oh yeah, yeah, you've got a friend.
Okay. So if you think of it and that friend is still with us or around, you might this week reach out to them and tell them that they were important to you, that they were God's messengers of presence and welcome in a time. You may not use that language because that would freak them out, but just tell them thanks. Thanks for being a friend. And I love that visitation is also captured, so that in Mary's story we get Gabriel, messenger of God, and we get Elizabeth, arms of God, right? Present to Mary in different ways. We're almost at time, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I do want to note that that what happens in the middle of that visit is that Mary has this canticle of Mary, or she speaks, or she sings this gorgeous song that, again, has been in church music and in church history and art forever, where she basically sort of declares that this experience is not only about her, though it is about her, but is also about the way that God works in the world, lifting up the lowly, bringing the mighty down from their thrones, filling the hungry with good things, that this is the good news of God, is that God is present, right? And that's her prophetic kind of speech into the world that's been really important for the church over time in giving us our marching orders about where we throw in our lot with people, that we throw it in with those who struggle, with those who are outcast in prison, those kinds of things, right? It's been such a heart of the Christian tradition, is that prophetic word. And so I'm not going to actually ask you to share this with each other because I want us to have a little time for talk back and conversation, but yeah, the goodness, what visions of goodness does your own experience of incarnation invite you to proclaim? I think what was at stake for Dolores Williams and other people who were worried about the visions of goodness that sacrifice on behalf of others unleashed in the world, I think likewise we can celebrate the visions of goodness that the idea of God's image restored in humanity unleashes in the world, the goodness that is, that's the story that we tell at Christmas. It is a lovely, sweet story about a baby in a manger and all the things that we do, but it's also this powerful story of salvation, that God took on human flesh so that we might be like God, that we too can throw in with the outcasts, things like that. So I think we have a microphone, and we can have questions, and we'll leave this as an evocative question, but if there are things you want to ask me about, I may or might not know the answers, or if there are things that these reflections have led to you and that you would like to share with the whole group, we'd be happy to hear those too. So what do we have to say to each other?
Raise your hand and I'll come to you.
We're left in stunned silence. That may be an appropriate response too. Here's a question.
This is on Kate.
Well, it's not really a question. I just wanted to say thank you. That was a magnificent interpretation of this.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was a gift to me to get asked to talk about this stuff. I don't get to wax theological very often in a pure way, so it's funny, like, oh yeah, let's talk about Mary and incarnation.
Anyone else?
What are your thoughts about, here's Mary, this young, very young at the time, and as we all know, she goes back, and Joseph is, yeah, sure. And then he has the vision and comes back. And what are your thoughts on kind of, and are there things in the Bible that you've picked up on or in your theology? How did she get through that? I mean, what kinds of support did she have when she went back? What kinds of, that couldn't have been an easy time for her to be pregnant as a single woman then. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the question is, how did Mary get through this experience, right? As a single woman, as a young woman, that Joseph also had his own set of dreams, if we listen to Matthew, right, and was told to go with this, right? And I think one of the things I've heard, interestingly, which is sort of archaeological work recently about the Christmas story. I think this is relevant, is, we often think of like Jesus being born in a stable where the manger was as like kind of the equivalent of being born in the garage or something, right? Like now, or like out in the back 40 or whatever. And there's been some people reminding us lately that in this era of time in Palestine, that the manger and where the animals lived was the home, right? They literally lived in people's houses. People lived with their animals, right? It's a later development that animals have their own living spaces. And that basically this was the difference in being born upstairs in the inn where visitors were supposed to be, or being born downstairs in the house, right? Where the animals were, and it was just overflowing down there. But Mary would have been surrounded by the family either way, which is an interesting thing, that we like want to make this experience of isolation or kind of deprivation. And there are great things that we do with that story, but that probably literally she was just born in the heart of where things were cared for here in the household. And so I think, the reality is, at least in my own experience, right, that these kind of shocking teenage pregnancies, right, are often horrifying at first, and then people surround those people with love and they make it work sometimes, right? And I wonder if that's not true for Mary. We have no evidence except that when Jesus was an adult and running around preaching, that his mother was around too, that she stuck with him, right? And so we do at least know that when he became an itinerant preacher, that she shows up at various points in the story. So she stuck with him, we know that. But there's not much in between, kind of like Jesus' life. There's not much in between. I guess she lost him in the temple too, when he was 12. But somehow I guess the community surrounded them and they made this work. And we know at this time that like getting kicked out of the community was pretty certain death, right? I mean, people didn't make it on their own in a nomadic community. We see this with American Indian tribal families too, that like it's really essential that you maintain a part of the community because it's very difficult to survive outside of that when you're living this kind of life. So she was taken back in at some point and made a part of the community, and she stuck with her family over time. That's all we know, really. But that's a lot right there. Yeah. Oh, there's another question in the back. It's the live stream that needs the mic, and we could probably hear you.
But with hearing aids, I still don't know if I'm talking. I just want to affirm what you're saying about... Talk to the mic. Okay. I want to affirm what you are saying about, and draw it out a little bit more about Jesus and the Jewish community and Mary not being alone. I was driving along a long stretch in Texas, and there was a nativity scene about 5 blocks long. That's very Texan. And so I'm driving along, and I'm on my way to church on Christmas Eve when I realized that the Jewish communities I know, they are not alone. And I see this little pregnant woman walking into a tavern, and I see all the Jewish women going, oh my God, she's fixing to blow any minute now. And that they made way. They probably yelled at the owner, get some rags, get some towels. Abraham, put that down and talk to the boy. And I really believe that while it benefits us to think he was born all alone, I believe he came into a community of caring people who, regardless of, they were nosy and intruding, and they were there for him.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think, I once saw a contemporary Jewish artist rendition of The Last Supper. So like when we think of The Last Supper, the first thing that comes to your mind visually is Da Vinci, right? 12 men on one side of a table, or 13. And this was an artistic rendering of what that meal would have really looked like, where people on cushions on the floor and reclining, and men and women all together there, and children. And I think there's a way in which the visuals we have for the story change who was there. And in reality, there were men and women there, and probably the women helped Mary give birth, right? Because that's who did it, right? So born into a community. I think it's really important sometimes to let those the little creche scenes that we all love and collect and put out, not override our sense of, yeah, of course, if there was a pregnant teenager, the women of the community would have helped her deliver the baby. Of course so. It was, it was a crowded town. There were people everywhere. Of course they weren't off on the back 40 somewhere by themselves. All right, well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. It was really a pleasure. You've given us a lot to ponder. So during Advent, appreciate it very much. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Next week, Jason will be doing our class on spiritual practices for Advent, so be sure to come back, okay?